Missing time. Some UFO stories begin with a light in the sky, but the most disturbing ones begin with a gap. A driver wakes beside the road with hours missing. A witness remembers a figure, a room, a beam of light, and then nothing. A child carries a memory for decades without knowing where it belongs. A farmer, a security guard, a fisherman, a police officer, all ordinary people, all describing the same impossible feeling. Something happened, and part of it is gone. Tonight, we follow 10 alien encounter cases where the mystery is not only what witnesses saw, but what they could not fully remember. Some of these reports are classic abduction cases. Others sit at the edge of missing time, contact, paralysis, and close encounters with beings. Together, they form one of the darkest patterns in UFO history. People who say they came face to face with something non-human and returned with questions that never left them. From lonely roads and fog-covered hills to quiet farms, rivers, bedrooms, and childhood memories, these are 10 cases where the encounter did not end when the object disappeared. It stayed inside the witness. This is 10 alien abduction cases with missing time that still haunt witnesses.
Bahia Blanca Abduction, 1973, Argentina. The Argentine city of Bahia Blanca, a port town on the southern edge of Buenos Aires province, was quiet on the night of May 31st, 1973. Streets emptied early, and the last buses rolled past darkened shop fronts. It was along one of these quiet routes that Dionisio Yanca, a 25-year-old truck driver, began what would become one of South America's most controversial abduction cases. His testimony, coupled with physical evidence and the involvement of both police and military authorities, has kept the Bahia Blanca case alive for decades. Yanca had set out shortly before midnight, transporting a load of tires from the port toward Rio Gallegos. His route was familiar, the kind of long haul he had done countless times. He stopped briefly outside the city to check his truck, tightening straps and inspecting his cargo. The night was cool, the roads nearly empty, and all seemed routine. Then, as he was preparing to climb back into the cab, he noticed a light moving low over the fields. At first, he thought it was the headlights of another vehicle cutting across the farmland, but as it drew closer, he realized it was airborne. The object descended silently, oval in shape, glowing with a bluish-white hue. Yanca later described it as large, perhaps 10 meters across, with a dome on top and lights along its rim. It hovered no more than 50 meters away, illuminating the grass in a pale shimmer. Fear took hold. Blanca tried to run toward the truck, but before he could reach it, a beam of light struck him. He recalled feeling paralyzed, unable to move as the object drew closer. Then, he lost consciousness. The next thing he remembered was waking at dawn by the side of the road, disoriented, with his truck parked nearby. He was bleeding from a wound on his head, his clothes disheveled, and his memory fragmented. Stumbling into Bahia Blanca hours later, he collapsed outside a service station. Workers called the Argentine Federal Police, who rushed him to a hospital. Doctors treated his injuries, bruises, cuts, and what appeared to be burns on his face and arms. They noted his confusion and partial amnesia, but also his sincerity. He did not appear drunk or delirious. When questioned by police officers, Blanca insisted he had been taken aboard a craft by figures he could not fully describe. His memories were fractured. Glimpses of a bright interior, sensations of pressure and heat, and the feeling of being observed by beings taller than himself. He claimed they communicated without speaking. The case immediately drew the attention of the Argentine Air Force's intelligence service, which had been monitoring UFO reports throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. Officers arrived in Bahia Blanca to interview Blanca, collect his clothing, and examine his truck. They logged his testimony in a classified report. According to local journalists, the Air Force officers were particularly interested in the burns on his skin and the fact that his wristwatch had stopped around the time of the encounter. The provincial police of Buenos Aires also filed their own report, noting the strangeness of the case and forwarding their findings to higher authorities. The involvement of both local police and the Air Force gave the incident unusual weight. Over the following weeks, Blanca underwent hypnosis sessions conducted by Argentine psychiatrists. Under regression, he described being floated aboard the craft, lying on a metallic table and surrounded by 3 figures. He said their faces were difficult to focus on, pale, elongated, with large eyes. They examined him with instruments, touched his skin with devices that emitted light, and seemed to be studying his blood. At one point, he recalled, one of the beings pricked his finger, drawing a sample. When asked under hypnosis what he felt, Blanca responded with fear and helplessness. Yet he also said the beings did not seem hostile, only clinical, as though he were an animal under observation. He remembered nothing further, only waking on the roadside hours later. The press seized on the story. Newspapers across Argentina carried headlines about the truck driver taken by a UFO. Some dismissed it as fantasy. Others treated it as a serious mystery. Radio programs replayed interviews with Blanca, who appeared shy, soft-spoken, and clearly disturbed by what had happened. Skeptics argued that Blanca might have suffered a head injury, causing hallucinations and memory gaps. But doctors who examined him said the burns on his skin were genuine and unlike injuries caused by ordinary accidents. Others suggested he had invented the story for publicity, yet those who knew him described him as modest and reluctant, with no history of seeking attention. The Air Force never released its conclusions, though investigators privately admitted that the case remained unexplained. Leaked accounts suggested that soil samples taken near the truck showed signs of unusual heating, and that Blanca's injuries were consistent with exposure to radiation. Whether these claims were exaggerated is still debated, but they reinforced the belief that the military had taken the case seriously. Over time, the Bahia Blanca abduction became one of the most famous UFO cases in Latin America. It combined elements rarely found together: a credible working-class witness, physical injuries, police documentation, Air Force involvement, and detailed recollections under hypnosis. For Blanca himself, the experience was deeply unsettling. He returned to work as a truck driver, but avoided speaking of the incident except when pressed by researchers. Interviews in later years show him still troubled, insisting that he had no reason to invent what he experienced. "They took me," he said simply. "I don't know why. I don't know who they were. But it happened." Researchers today classify the Bahia Blanca case as a close encounter of the fourth kind, an abduction. Its credibility rests on the convergence of factors: hospital records, police logs, Air Force interviews, and Blanca's consistent testimony over decades. While skeptics remain unconvinced, few deny that something extraordinary happened to him on that night in 1973. The case also reflects Argentina's unique role in global UFO history. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the country became a hotspot for sightings, pilots reporting discs over Bariloche, luminous objects near Cordoba, and abduction accounts in rural provinces. The Air Force's quiet but persistent interest suggested that Argentina, like many nations, was grappling with aerial phenomena beyond easy explanation. Today, the roads outside Bahia Blanca look much the same. Flat pampas stretching toward the horizon, dotted with trucks hauling goods across the province. But for those who remember the story, the night of May 31st, 1973, remains singular. It is recalled as the time when an ordinary man, doing an ordinary job, stepped briefly into the extraordinary. A night when light descended, time fractured, and the witness was left changed forever. The Bahia Blanca abduction remains unexplained. No medical condition, no hoax, and no ordinary accident accounts for the convergence of evidence. For Blanca, it was not theory, but memory, the glow in the fields, the paralysis, the figures leaning over him, and the long, empty hours before dawn. For the Argentine authorities, it was another file to be marked unresolved. And for the public, it was a story that blurred the line between the known and the unknown, one that still unsettles those who hear it more than half a century later. The Emilcin Abduction, May 10th, 1978. Emilcin, Lublin Voivodeship, Poland. By the late 1970s, Emilcin was like many small villages tucked into the eastern farmland of Poland, quiet, isolated, and largely untouched by modernity. Most families farmed or raised animals. Jan Wolski was 71 years old in the spring of 1978. He had lived in Emilcin his entire life. A modest man, Wolski was known for being calm, hard-working, and deeply rooted in the land. He had never read science fiction. He didn't own a radio. And when he spoke, people listened, not out of deference, but because he rarely said more than necessary. That morning, May 10th, dawn was pale and cool. Wolski rose early, as he always did, and fed the horses. His plan was to deliver a small load of potatoes to a neighboring hamlet. Harnessing his mare to the wooden cart, he rolled down a narrow, rutted forest road just beyond the tree line. Then he saw them. Two figures were walking along the edge of the path. At first, Wolski thought they might be young men from the next village, perhaps mushroom foragers, which wasn't uncommon in spring. But as his cart approached, he slowed. Something about their movements was off. Their limbs moved strangely, too smooth, too fluid. They wore dark, form-fitting overalls made of a material Wolski couldn't identify. Their skin was pale, almost olive gray. Their faces were small and narrow, with almond-shaped eyes set wider apart than seemed natural. They had no visible hair, no eyebrows, no ears. They spoke to each other in a language he could not understand. Quick, sharp syllables that didn't resemble Polish or Ukrainian or anything he'd heard in his lifetime. Wolski didn't panic. He said later that he simply observed, as he always did when working around animals or in the woods. The two figures then silently motioned for him to come with them. No weapons, no force. Just an odd sense of expectation. He climbed off his cart, following them roughly 30 meters into the forest. There, in a clearing he had known since childhood, sat a large object suspended about 5 feet above the ground. It didn't rest on legs or wheels. It floated. The object was boxy, nearly the shape of a small barn, but rounded at the corners. Its surface was metallic, dull white or silver, and seemed seamless, without rivets or seams. A ramp protruded from the lower portion, and without hesitation, the figures walked up it. Wolski followed. Inside was quiet. No hum, no vibration, just silence and a faint smell. He compared it to ozone or freshly cut mushrooms. The interior was lit, but he couldn't see any obvious lamps or bulbs. The light had no source. It simply was. There were 4 other beings inside, dressed the same, speaking the same strange tongue. They motioned to Wolski to remove his clothes. Again, he said later that he felt no fear, only confusion and a sense of being observed, studied, but not harmed. He undressed to his underwear and stood on a platform while one of the beings appeared to inspect him with a small device, no bigger than a deck of cards. It emitted no sound. He wasn't touched. The inspection took less than a minute. Another being opened a small cabinet and removed what looked like a biscuit. Wolski refused to take it. After what he guessed was 15 minutes, the same 2 beings who had led him into the craft gestured for him to leave. He dressed and stepped back down the ramp. The object remained hovering silently as he returned to his horse and cart. Moments later, from a distance of about 30 meters, Wolski turned back. The craft lifted, without dust, without sound, rose vertically through the trees, and vanished into the sky. The 2 beings were gone. Wolski arrived home mid-morning and immediately told his family what had happened. His sons, skeptical but curious, walked with him back to the clearing. What they found was simple but undeniable. 4 square impressions in the soil, spaced evenly, each about the size of a shoebox. The grass around them was slightly depressed, as though by weight, not scorched, not broken, just pressed. The trees around the site were untouched. Word spread quickly. Within a day, neighbors and villagers were making their way to the site. Children played near the impressions, mothers whispered, and men smoked silently, glancing upward. 2 days later, a group of researchers arrived from Warsaw. Among them was psychologist and UFO researcher Zbigniew Bolnar, who conducted interviews and filmed Wolski recounting his experience. The footage still survives today. In it, Wolski appears calm, lucid, and direct. His story never wavers, and he speaks without embellishment. He describes the object as simply as a man might describe a cart or a barn. The beings were not aggressive. The experience, while strange, did not frighten him. When asked why he thought it happened, he only shrugged. They wanted to see, he said, to examine. Blanca Bolnar and his team conducted soil analysis at the site. No radioactive trace was found, no elevated magnetism, just slightly compacted impressions matching Wolski's description of the object's legs or supports. Over time, more witnesses came forward. A boy claimed to have seen a bright light descending toward the woods that morning. A local beekeeper noted that his hives had been unusually quiet on May 10th. A young woman reported hearing a strange buzzing, like wind through metal, at dawn. None of them had spoken to Wolski beforehand. No official investigation followed, at least not one made public. But according to later reports, Poland's Ministry of Internal Affairs, MSW, quietly collected sightings from rural areas throughout the 1970s and 1980s, especially cases involving visual craft or ground traces. Internal memos from the era, later obtained by Polish researchers, suggest that Wolski's case was noted but never acted on. Years passed, and Wolski continued farming, tending his horses, and attending Sunday Mass. He never changed his story, never sought attention. When asked again in the 1980s by another visiting researcher, if he stood by what he said, he simply nodded. There was nothing to gain, he said. Why would I lie? In 2005, a monument was erected at the edge of the Emilcin forest, a tall stone column with a stylized depiction of the craft and an inscription that reads, "On 10th May, 1978 in Emilcin, a UFO object landed. The truth will astonish us in the future." To this day, the story remains one of Poland's most widely documented and investigated UFO cases. Blanca Bolnar's reports were published in national journals. The Polish government never issued a formal statement. For researchers of high strangeness, Emilcin represents something rare, a case with a singular witness of high credibility, immediate physical impressions, psychological evaluation, and secondary local corroboration, all within a Cold War Eastern Bloc setting, far from Western media influence. And for the village itself, the story never became spectacle. It stayed what it always was, a strange morning, quietly told, quietly remembered. Why Jan Wolski was chosen, or what exactly the beings were looking for, remains unknown. But Emilcin remembers, even if the world does not. The Zanfretta Abductions, December 6, 1978, Torriglia, Italy. The Fiat's headlights pierced the dense fog curling through the Ligurian mountains, illuminating narrow ribbons of asphalt and frozen stone walls. Midnight was near in the village of Torriglia, and the road to the remote vacation estate known as Villa Casa Nostra was deserted. No other cars, no sounds, only the hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of tires over ice. Inside the tiny security patrol vehicle, Pier Fortunato Zanfretta gripped the wheel tighter than usual. He didn't know why, but something felt wrong. Minutes later, he parked and stepped out, boots sinking into damp soil, flashlight slicing through the darkness. The air was dense, almost charged. A strange pressure built in his ears, as if the atmosphere itself were reacting to something unseen. His breath fogged before him in short, uneasy bursts as he approached the villa grounds. Then, the silence shattered. A movement, quick, massive, stirred the hedgerows. Zanfretta stopped. His light caught something that shouldn't have been there. Towering figures, nearly 3 meters tall, standing motionless in the bushes. Their skin was scaled and greenish, their eyes glowed yellow. They wore bulky metallic suits, hissing faintly. Zanfretta's mouth went dry. He reached for his pistol, but before he could draw, a searing white light enveloped him. He screamed. The radio in his car crackled to life. "Zanfretta, come in." No response, only static. And then, huge, terrible beings. They're here. The transmission cut out. When the carabinieri found him an hour later, the patrol car's engine was still running. Zanfretta sat inside, shaking, unable to speak, his eyes wide with terror. Burn marks marred his uniform. His pistol was back in its holster, untouched, though he had no memory of ever retrieving it. The official report would list the time as 1:10 a.m. That moment marked the beginning of one of the most chilling and well-documented alien abduction cases in European history. In the hours that followed, Zanfretta attempted to recount what had happened. He spoke of being lifted into a craft by a column of blinding light, of being surrounded by enormous reptilian beings who communicated telepathically. They said they were from the third galaxy, a planet orbiting Tau Ceti. They had been watching, studying, waiting. and he had been chosen. The media storm began almost immediately. Italy's major newspapers ran headlines about the terrified security guard who claimed to have met extraterrestrials. Many scoffed, but the Carabinieri's report, publicly available, spoke of emotional shock, physical traces, and a serious, consistent account. It was enough to attract the attention of researchers, psychologists, and skeptics alike. In the weeks that followed, Zanfretta underwent a series of hypnosis sessions under the guidance of Dr. Mauro Moretti from the International Center of Medical Hypnosis in Milan. These sessions were recorded and analyzed. Under hypnosis, Zanfretta described multiple abductions, each time providing new and consistent details. He spoke of glowing panels, alien machinery, and a clear warning: humans were not ready for contact. The descriptions never wavered. The beings were huge, at least 9 feet tall, with bumpy skin, clawed hands, and glowing eyes. Their technology was beyond comprehension, and yet their tone was strangely clinical, even cold. In one session, Zanfretta broke down in tears, recalling how one creature had inserted a clear sphere into his skull. It was meant to monitor him, they said. His role was not just as a witness, but as an unwilling messenger. More unsettling still were the repeated disappearances. On several occasions in 1979 and 1980, Zanfretta vanished from his patrol route, only to be found hours later in distant locations, dazed, drenched in sweat, and suffering from amnesia. During one incident, other guards reported seeing a strange light shoot into the sky moments before Zanfretta's radio went silent. When he was found, he could barely speak. Investigators documented the cases thoroughly. Soil samples from the original site were compressed and slightly scorched. Semicircular indentations in the earth suggested the presence of an extremely heavy object. Witnesses from the village reported strange lights in the sky on the night of the first abduction. One local, a mechanic named Carlo Rossi, said his dog barked wildly and refused to go near the wooded area near the villa for days. Yet perhaps the most convincing evidence was Zanfretta himself. He never sought money, fame, or publicity. He turned down book offers. He refused most media appearances. When he finally did appear on Italian television in the mid-1880s, it was clear he was uncomfortable. His hands trembled, and his eyes darted nervously as he recounted his story once more. Despite this, his account remained unchanged. Journalist Rino Di Stefano, who investigated the case for over a decade, interviewed Zanfretta numerous times and reviewed official police files, hypnosis tapes, and corroborating witness statements. He became convinced that Zanfretta believed every word he said and had suffered tremendously because of it. Di Stefano published multiple articles and a book compiling the vast documentation behind the case. The public remained divided. Skeptics argued that Zanfretta might have suffered hallucinations or psychological trauma, though extensive mental health evaluations at the time found no signs of psychosis or delusion. Others believed that his story fit too closely with emerging accounts of alien abductions around the world to be coincidence. In the small town of Torriglia, where the hills are still quiet and the roads still twist through the mountains, memories of that strange winter night linger. A small plaque near the villa now marks the alleged landing site, placed there not as proof, but as recognition of one man's unwavering testimony. Zanfretta, now retired and living in obscurity, rarely speaks publicly anymore, but he never recanted. In a rare interview decades later, he said quietly, "I didn't want this. I still wish it had never happened, but I can't forget what I saw, and I never will." The case remains open, both literally and figuratively. No one has been able to disprove Zanfretta's account, and perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. If what he claimed was true, then we are not alone. And someone, or something, chose a solitary night watchman in a mountain village to remind us of that fact. The Alagamar Abduction, 1991, Alagamar, Maranhão, Brazil. The night river was mirror still, reflecting only moonlight and the ripple of distant insects. 4 fishermen, José, Miguel, Raul, and old João, had built a small fire on the sandy bank of the Gurupi River near Alagamar, Maranhão. They were on their usual night expedition, harvesting freshwater crayfish in the winding waterway. Rainforest darkness enveloped them, broken only by the soft glow of their flames and the distant calls of nocturnal birds. Just past midnight, the firelight flickered unnaturally. The men exchanged puzzled glances. Then, from the tree line on the opposite bank, came bright lights, like searchlights, intensely white and steady, slowly descending between the trees. At first, they thought it might be a passing boat or low-flying helicopter, but as the lights approached, their calm water set no ripples, their hum made no sound, and their brilliance didn't soften. The beams converged and illuminated the fire-lit camp in stark brilliance. The 4 fishermen froze. Raul, closest to the river, stepped back into the water and vanished. One moment, he was diving for a crayfish basket. The next, he was gone. Panicked, José cried out. Miguel and João ran toward the forest's edge. The bright lights pulsed again. The night became oppressive with their sudden absence and the unnatural radiance. They called out for Raul, but only echoes returned. Moments stretched. Then, as abruptly as they had come, the lights vanished, one by one, retreating upward into the night until the forest canopy swallowed them. The darkness crept back over the river, and only the soft crackle of the dying campfire remained. Shaken, the 2 men stumbled to the shoreline and found Raul gasping and soaked, standing knee-deep in water. Dazed, his face was pale, his eyes vacant. He spoke no word. Miguel screamed for help. Old João yelled for a doctor. Within 20 minutes, they had carried him to their boat and began a frantic journey to the nearest town, some 40 kilometers upriver. By dawn, they reached a clinic in a small riverside town. The doctor, initially skeptical, found Raul severely disoriented. He couldn't recall how he'd disappeared, or even his name at times. On his hands and forearms were reddish burn marks, circular and precise, unlike common burns or insect bites. The doctor noted them carefully, a strange pattern of healing lesions on his skin. Before long, local authorities became involved. The fishermen's statements were recorded in a police file. Each recounted the lights, the sudden vanishing, and Raul's reappearance, but none had any explanation. They reported no boat, no aircraft, no collector's torch. Just lights descending silently from the forest, and their friend returning minutes later with no memory. The fishermen were experienced river workers, accustomed to the isolation of the Maranhão rainforest. Their daily lives depended on routine and nature's steadiness. But that night, routine shattered. The remote riverbank had felt safe, or at least predictable. The bright lights broke that trust and toppled their world in an instant. Despite Raul's shock, the men insisted they continue. They packed camp quickly, but none slept. The river felt colder, darker, unsettled. Even the animals seemed on edge. Mosquitoes swarmed. Eels darted at the edges of their lamps' glow. Birds screeched overhead, like alarms. Multiple witnesses agreed. 3 distinct beams of white light, cold, silent, and glassy, emerged between treetops and approached the camp. The lights didn't cast shadows, but flattened depth, making the fire's glow seem weak. Nobody estimated how high the lights hovered, but they were bright enough to affect night vision. Raoul's disappearance was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment he was bending over the water, the next he was gone, submerged in water, with no splash, no disturbance. He reappeared moments later, uneasy and confused. The lights pulsed once more and retreated into the forest, extinguishing as mysteriously as they had appeared. The fisherman described a sense of being scanned, watched, and protected oddly. At the clinic, Raoul could not speak coherently for an hour. His family and friends recognized him, but said he seemed hollow, like he carried a distance in his eyes. His burns, 2 concentric circles, about an inch wide, were painful. The doctor could find no logical cause, no campfire spark, no insect hive, no chemical exposure. Raoul later insisted he had seen nothing after the lights. Just darkness, he said. Then I was here. His memory came back slowly and incompletely. He blinked as if perceiving his own hands for the first time. The police recorded the testimony meticulously. Officers noted the men's fear and consistency in recollection. No money or benefit was sought. They were fishermen, deeply tied to the land and water, and unnerved. Over the following weeks, Alagamar saw increased reports of strange events, bright lights over the river, disappearances of fishing nets, strange ripples in water at night. A few villagers reported hearing humming vibrations near the shore. Some felt light pulses against their skin when they walked near the forest edge at dawn. By late 1991, a Brazilian UFO research group visited the site. They documented multiple accounts of the original incident and several smaller anomalies. Soil samples from the riverbank where Raoul vanished had subtle discoloration and magnetic irregularities, though no radiation. Photographic records of the burns and of Raoul's dazed state were taken. Medical notes confirmed his acute disorientation, memory loss, and circular burns. Local press featured the story for weeks. Editors translated the English idiom abduction into raptura cautiously. The case became a minor national curiosity, but remote enough to avoid sensational headlines. 2 critical documents support the incident: the official police records from Alagamar and the medical records by the attending doctor. Copies circulated to UFO research groups in Brazil in the early 1990s. They include consistent descriptions of the burns, round lesions, strong headaches, and short-term amnesia. Photos of Raoul's arms and forearms, still marked after 2 weeks, exist in archived files. Research group logs correlate several reported sightings near the area through late 1991. None as dramatic, but consistent with bright nighttime lights above the river and forest. This case fits the archetype of wilderness abductions: isolated location, small group of non-sensational eyewitnesses, sudden disappearance and return, physical evidence, and partial memory loss. Yet it remains singular in Brazil for its credible local records and multiple witnesses who never sought publicity. The Gurupi River Basin is remote, dense, rich in biodiversity, and rarely visited at night. Yet that isolation might make it a beacon for certain phenomena. Other communities in Maranhão report seeing lights near rivers, and sometimes people report missing time. Could the natural darkness, humidity, and forest canopy focus or attract these events? Was Raoul deliberately chosen, or was his disappearance accidental collateral? Did the lights serve as drawing or scanning systems? Were they technological probes or natural anomalies responding to human settlement? Decades later, the Alagamar Abduction remains largely known only to Brazilian UFO scholars. Most official agencies have not revisited the case. No explanatory theory has been published. Raul has long since returned to fishing, haunted but resilient. His burns healed. His memory, though fragmented, holds firm the faint echo of circular lights and sudden absence. For those who study such contact events, especially in isolated regions, the Alagamar incident stands as evidence that strange encounters often follow recurring patterns: remote wilderness, nighttime lights, sudden vanishing, burns, amnesia, and community silence. It leaves us asking, why here? Why then? And above all, why the silence that followed? The Night Siege of Ilkley Moor, December 1st, 1987. Ilkley Moor, Yorkshire, UK. It was bitterly cold when Philip Spencer set out just after 7 a.m. The fog clung low to the moors, the frost etched into every blade of grass, and silence hung thick over the Yorkshire hills. A former police officer turned security guard, Spencer had taken the morning off to visit his father-in-law. He brought with him a camera, hoping to capture the haunting winter scenery of Ilkley Moor. But what he ended up capturing, at least according to him, was something else entirely. Something unexplainable. Spencer had moved with his family to Yorkshire earlier that year. A quiet man, known for his seriousness and rational thinking, he was not the sort one would associate with wild tales. He had a solid reputation, and those who knew him described him as reliable and calm, not prone to fantasy. That morning, as he trudged along the path into the moorland, he carried a compass and a camera in his coat pocket. The light was poor, and visibility was limited to a few hundred feet at most. His journey was supposed to be simple: cut across the moor and take the train to his father-in-law's house. But within half an hour, Spencer claimed, everything changed. He crested a small ridge and noticed something strange just down the path. A figure, about 4 feet tall, hunched, with a large head and elongated limbs. At first, he thought it might be a child, but then it turned toward him. Its skin, he said, was pale greenish-gray, and its face was unmistakably not human. Large black eyes, small mouth, no visible nose. The creature moved quickly, and instinctively Spencer raised his camera and took a photo. The figure turned and darted up a hillside, disappearing over the ridge. Stunned, Spencer sprinted in the same direction, reaching the top only seconds later. But the figure was gone. What he did see, though, froze him in place. In the valley below was a large, metallic craft, hovering, silent, with a faint blue glow beneath it. Spencer said it lifted slowly, tilted to one side, and vanished into the fog. No sound, no rush of wind. Just gone. Disoriented, he reached for his compass and noticed something was wrong. The needle spun erratically, unable to find north. His watch had stopped. He didn't know how much time had passed, but it felt as though only minutes had gone by. Still shaken, he hurried across the moor and caught a later train than he'd planned. When he arrived at his father-in-law's home, he checked the time. It was nearly 2 hours later than it should have been, and he couldn't account for it. 2 hours. Missing. Over the following days, Spencer couldn't shake the experience. He developed the film and found, to his disbelief, that the photograph had captured something. It was grainy and out of focus, but there, unmistakably, was a figure. Humanoid. Short, with a bulbous head and strange proportions. It stood mid-stride on a gravel path. Skeptics argued the figure was just a person in a suit or even a hoax. But the photograph was sent to multiple photographic analysis labs, including one at Kodak. Experts could not determine what the figure was, but they did confirm the image was genuine and had not been tampered with. The negatives were clean. There were no signs of double exposure or manipulation. The British UFO Research Association, BUFORA, took interest. They arranged for Spencer to undergo hypnotic regression, curious to know if he could recall more of the missing time. The results were unsettling. Under hypnosis, Spencer recalled that after he took the photo and crested the hill, he had been surrounded by a bright light and lifted into the air. He described being paralyzed, then finding himself inside a sterile metallic room. There, he said, the beings examined him. His blood taken, his eyes inspected, his limbs tested. He recalled seeing images projected onto the walls, visions of war, environmental destruction, and then peaceful landscapes. He was told, telepathically, that he would forget until the time was right. Then, he was left back on the moor, disoriented, as if waking from a dream. Many dismissed the hypnosis results as influenced by suggestion or imagination, but others noted the consistency with reports from other alleged abductees worldwide. Spencer never sought fame, never tried to profit from the encounter. He refused media interviews and requested anonymity for years. His identity only became public later, long after the original event. The photo he took remains one of the most controversial and enduring pieces of alleged UFO evidence in the UK. It has been scrutinized, enhanced, and debated for decades. Some insist it shows nothing but a trick of light, a misinterpreted bush, or even a prankster in a costume. But no one has ever definitively debunked it. The location, Ilkley Moor, has its own legends. Locals have long spoken of strange lights in the sky, livestock disappearing, and eerie sounds at night. In 1987, weeks before Spencer's sighting, several residents reported seeing odd lights above the moor, including one witness who claimed a glowing sphere hovered silently above her house. None of that made national news. It stayed within the community, mostly dismissed. Until Spencer came forward. What makes the Ilkley Moor case compelling to researchers isn't just the photo or the regression. It's the man himself. He was not interested in UFOs. He didn't follow the phenomenon. He worked in law enforcement, a grounded and skeptical profession. Those who interviewed him noted his consistent account, his discomfort with attention, and his unwillingness to embellish. He never changed his story. Years later, Spencer would move away and refuse to talk about the event in detail. He felt it had defined his life in ways he hadn't asked for. "I saw something," he told a journalist once. "I know what I saw, and it wasn't a man in a suit. It wasn't a helicopter or a plane. I wish I hadn't seen it." Today, the moors remain unchanged, wind-swept, fog-covered, timeless. Hikers still walk the same paths, and once in a while, someone stops, looks up, sees something they can't explain. Ilkley Moor doesn't offer answers, but it still holds the memory of a cold December morning when one man went looking for scenery and found something else entirely. Something that, for over 3 decades, no one has been able to explain away. The Stan Romanek Files, 2000s, Colorado, USA. It began with a knock on the window. Stan Romanek, a former pipe fitter and aspiring writer, was watching TV alone in his modest home in Colorado when he heard it. A tapping, rhythmic, intentional. He paused, muted the television, and leaned toward the sound. Nothing. Then it came again. When he pulled back the curtain, he saw it. A figure, not tall, slender, pale gray skin and oversized black almond-shaped eyes. It stood motionless just beyond the glass for no more than 2 seconds. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. Romanek stumbled back, heart pounding. He grabbed his camera, ran outside, but the yard was empty, just stillness under a moonless sky. What began as a curious and terrifying moment would spiral into one of the most prolific and controversial UFO abduction cases in modern history. Romanek claimed that this was just the beginning. In the early 2000s, Stan began experiencing what he described as continued and escalating contact with non-human entities. Lights in the sky, sudden blackouts, mysterious injuries, and missing time all became part of his daily life. But unlike most who report abduction phenomena, Romanek documented everything. He began keeping a detailed log of every incident, dates, times, symptoms. He set up cameras around his home. He installed motion sensors. He saved voicemails that he claimed came from government agents. Romanek said he received messages in strange languages and symbols, sometimes written in his own handwriting despite no memory of doing so. And then came the math. One of the most baffling pieces of Romanek's story involved what he called downloads, spurts of sudden, uncontrollable writing in the form of complex mathematical equations and geometric diagrams. At least 2 physicists later reviewed some of the formulas and confirmed that they aligned with legitimate advanced concepts in gravitational physics, concepts Romanek had no known training to produce. He also claimed to have developed a permanent injury, damaged cartilage in his shoulder, after being violently pulled from his bed and dropped back into it. The injury, verified by medical records, baffled his doctors due to its sudden and severe nature. In one particularly disturbing incident, Stan filmed what he later called the Boo video. Using a handheld camera, he recorded himself reacting to strange noises near his window. In the footage, a small gray face quickly peeks into view before darting away. The video, released publicly, became one of the most talked about alleged alien recordings in UFO circles. Skeptics pounced, calling it a hoax, but others found it too unsettling and too well-timed to be easily dismissed. But what made Romanek's case stand apart from typical abduction claims was the volume and variety of alleged evidence. Over the course of nearly a decade, he amassed photographs of strange lights in the sky over Colorado and Nebraska, video recordings of anomalous craft hovering near his home, electronic interference and mysterious power surges, phone calls with synthetic, mechanical voices warning him to stop speaking publicly, reports of unmarked black vans parked outside his home for days at a time, eyewitness accounts from family and neighbors who corroborated seeing strange lights and unexplained figures near his property. One of the more chilling pieces of footage came from a home surveillance camera in which Romanek appears to be levitating out of bed, his body rising several inches off the mattress before slumping back down. During a 2003 appearance on NBC's The Jane Pauley Show, Romanek collapsed live on set after an emotional retelling of his experience. Backstage footage later showed him disoriented, sweating, and struggling to regain awareness. But as attention grew, so did scrutiny. Skeptics and debunkers soon launched deep investigations into Romanek's background, character, and methods. Some noted that the alien voices left on his voicemail were easy to reproduce with voice modulation software. Others claimed that the Boo video could have been made with a puppet and clever lighting. Several UFO researchers who had once supported Romanek eventually distanced themselves, citing inconsistencies in his timelines, contradictions in his own interviews, and possible embellishment. One even suggested that Romanek had too much evidence, that the sheer volume made it less credible, not more. Still, Romanek's defenders pointed to the variety and complexity of the documentation, arguing that no single person could fabricate such an intricate web of physical, audio, and video evidence without help or motive. In 2009, Romanek took a polygraph test for a documentary film crew. The results were inconclusive. When asked about faking alien contact, his responses showed signs of deception. But Romanek later claimed that the stress of the test, combined with threats he said he had received before the interview, affected the outcome. Then, the controversy escalated into something much darker. In 2014, police executed a search warrant on Romanek's home. He was later charged with possession of child pornography. The trial gained national media attention and deeply polarized public opinion. Romanek pleaded not guilty, insisting the materials had been planted by government agents in retaliation for his UFO disclosures. His home computer had reportedly been hacked multiple times, and Romanek claimed that malware had been used to remotely access and upload illicit files without his knowledge. However, a jury ultimately convicted him in 2017. He received 2 years of intensive supervised probation and was required to register as a sex offender. The conviction effectively dismantled any mainstream support for his UFO claims. Even longtime supporters found it difficult to reconcile the two sides of the story: the man who claimed to be in contact with non-human intelligence and the man convicted of possessing child pornography. But some of the evidence from before the arrest remains deeply troubling and still unexplained. For example, the mathematical codes. Independent physicists confirmed that several of Romanek's handwritten pages contained accurate formulas related to gravitational lensing and energy propagation, topics he had no known academic background in. One of the phone calls he recorded included a digital voice warning: "You have been told not to speak." Forensic audio analysis indicated that the signal had been routed through a complex masking system and originated outside the country. Eyewitnesses, including Romanek's then-wife, repeatedly confirmed seeing lights in the sky and experiencing electronic malfunctions that coincided with his abduction claims. And most significantly, several incidents of missing time, including one where Romanek was found miles from home, disoriented and barefoot in freezing temperatures, were documented by emergency responders. He had no memory of how he got there. To some, Stan Romanek is a fraud, a manipulator who used the UFO community for attention and profit. To others, he is a tragic figure, possibly unstable, possibly exploited, who may have truly experienced something unexplainable, but whose credibility was irreparably damaged by his later legal issues. The files he left behind, hundreds of hours of video, reams of notes, medical records, and first-hand testimonies, remain a tangled mess of fact, fiction, and mystery. Many researchers have attempted to separate the real phenomena from the man himself. Few have succeeded. Today, Romanek lives in relative obscurity. Most UFO documentaries avoid his story entirely, considering it too toxic to touch. And yet, the footage remains. The equations remain. The unexplained lights captured by multiple witnesses remain. What do we make of a man who may have recorded one of the most detailed, disturbing alien contact stories in history, only to destroy his credibility through his own actions, or perhaps through a carefully orchestrated takedown? In the end, the Romanek case may not be about belief. It may be about the limits of trust, about how far we're willing to go when presented with overwhelming evidence tainted by a single, damning flaw, and how easily the truth can vanish when the messenger collapses under its weight. The Glastonbury Gogos, 1983, Connecticut, USA. MUFON case number 76182. In the summer of 1983, in the quiet town of Glastonbury, Connecticut, an unusual childhood memory took root. The town, like much of New England, carried a sense of history in its streets and homes, old farmhouses, leafy neighborhoods, and woods that seemed endless to a child's eyes. It was the kind of place where kids played freely after school, riding bikes until dusk, chasing fireflies in the yard, and returning home only when porch lights flickered on. Life was ordinary, safe, and familiar. But one young boy would later file a report with MUFON, describing an encounter that was anything but ordinary. He called them the Gogos. The account stands out in MUFON's database not just because of its strangeness, but because of the way it carried the innocence and clarity of a child's recollection. It wasn't a fleeting light in the sky or a distant object. It was personal, close, and terrifyingly intimate. The witness was 8 years old at the time. He recalled the night with the sharpness of memory that never faded. "It started in my bedroom," he said. "I woke up and they were just there." At first, he thought he was dreaming. Children often wake in the night with strange images lingering from sleep. But this was different. The figures were too vivid, too detailed, too real. They were short, maybe 4 feet tall. Their skin was gray, their heads larger than ours, and their eyes were big, black, and slanted. But what I remember most was the buttons on their suits. They wore something tight, like a uniform, and each one had buttons that glowed faintly. I called them the Gogos because of the sound they seemed to make, like a rhythm in my head. Go-go, go-go. The boy lay frozen, staring at the beings by his bed. He wasn't sure how many there were. 3, maybe 4. They didn't speak with mouths. Instead, their thoughts pressed directly into his mind. "I could hear them in my head," he said. "They told me not to be afraid." But I was terrified. The figures moved slowly, deliberately. One of them reached toward him, touching his arm. The sensation wasn't painful, but it was strange, like a vibration under his skin. He remembered trying to scream for his parents, but no sound came. I wanted to yell, but nothing came out. I tried to move, but I couldn't. I was just stuck there, staring into their eyes. They weren't angry, but they weren't kind either. They were just there, looking at me like I was something to study. For what felt like minutes, the beings surrounded him. He noticed details that would be odd for a child to invent. The way their hands had long fingers, the way the air in the room felt thicker, heavier, almost humming. He described the faint glow of their suits, and the way their large eyes reflected the dim light like pools of ink. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. He blinked, and the room was empty. The air felt still again. He sat up, trembling, and ran down the hall to his parents' bedroom. But when he tried to explain, his words tumbled out as confused fragments. They reassured him it was just a nightmare and sent him back to bed. But he knew it wasn't a dream. "I was wide awake," he later told MUFON investigators. "It wasn't in my head. It was in my room." For years, he carried the memory silently. As he grew older, he began to wonder if others had experienced similar encounters. When he discovered MUFON decades later, he decided to file his account. By then, he was an adult, but the memory remained as vivid as the night it happened. I can still see them when I close my eyes. I can still feel the touch on my arm. It never left me. I never told many people about it, because who would believe me? But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. MUFON investigators noted the consistency of his description with countless other bedroom visitation cases reported worldwide. The glowing buttons on the suits were unusual, but the rest matched the archetype. Short gray beings, large eyes, telepathic communication, paralysis, and a sense of being examined. Some researchers believe such accounts reflect sleep paralysis, a state in which the body is immobilized while the mind is partly awake, often producing vivid hallucinations. But this witness pushed back against that explanation. I've had bad dreams before. I know what a dream feels like. This wasn't that. This was real. I remember the details too clearly. I even remember the smell in the room, like metal, sharp and strange. The Gogos, as he called them, never returned. He lived in the same house for years afterward without incident, yet the encounter left a deep impression, shaping his understanding of the world. It made me realize we're not alone. I was just a kid, but I saw them. I know they were real. For MUFON, the Glastonbury case remains open. It is categorized as unexplained, with no supporting physical evidence, but with a testimony that aligns closely with thousands of similar reports across decades. The childhood clarity, the descriptive details, and the lingering emotional weight give it a haunting resonance. The witness reflected later. When I think back, I don't remember fear as much as I remember being overwhelmed. They weren't human. They didn't belong in my room, but they were there. And that changed everything. Today, nearly 40 years later, the account still stands as one of those personal stories that defies simple dismissal. A boy, 8 years old, alone in his room, waking to find beings that looked and felt real, communicating without words, and leaving him with a memory that time has never erased. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't a nightmare. I called them the Gogos because I didn't know what else to call them. But I know they were real. And with that, the Glastonbury case remains not just a file number in MUFON's archive, but a testament to how even a child's eyes can witness the inexplicable, a moment when the ordinary night gave way to something otherworldly and left behind a mystery that endures. The Shropshire Farm CE2, late summer 1975, near Ludlow, Shropshire, England. The morning was calm over the low fields of Shropshire, a pale haze clinging to the hedgerows. David Henshaw, a 46-year-old livestock farmer, was making his first round of the paddocks, the damp grass still marked with the tracks of his boots from the day before. His routine was always the same: check the fences, count the animals, and walk the perimeter for signs of trespass or damage. It was a quiet time of year, with no lambing to keep him awake at night, and few visitors beyond the odd delivery truck on the lane. It was in the far corner of a grazing field that he first noticed something unusual. At a glance, he thought it might be a small van or a piece of farm machinery left by a neighbor, but the shape didn't match anything familiar. It was too compact, too rounded, and oddly poised above the grass on 3 slender supports. The early light picked out the smooth surface, which had none of the bolts, panels, or painted markings of farm equipment. Henshaw climbed the stile and began walking toward it. His boots sank slightly in the soft ground, the dew still fresh on the pasture. The closer he got, the stranger the object appeared. An oval body, no more than 4 meters across, with a low dome on top and a dull metallic sheen, The supports were evenly spaced and pressed into the soil, but there were no tire marks or tracks leading to the spot. He was still puzzling over its presence when movement beside it caught his eye. Two figures, no taller than his chest, stood near one of the supports. They were dressed head to toe in close-fitting silvery gray suits that clung to their frames without a single crease. Their heads seemed large in proportion to their bodies, pale and smooth in a way that made it hard to tell if they were wearing helmets or if that was simply their skin. One of them turned abruptly towards him. In that moment, Henshaw's body froze. His legs locked in place, his arms hung uselessly at his sides, and even his breathing slowed. It was not like faintness or cramp. It was as though every muscle had been switched off, yet he remained fully aware. The figures exchanged a glance that he could only interpret as communication, then turned and stepped toward the craft. A faint hum began to rise in the air, accompanied by the slightest vibration through the ground. The craft lifted vertically, the three supports folding smoothly beneath it. There was no wash of air, no dust or grass stirred, and yet it rose with complete steadiness. Once clear of the hedgerow, it angled sharply and sped away, vanishing in seconds. The hum faded, leaving the field utterly still. Just as suddenly as it had come on, the paralysis released him. Henshaw staggered slightly, taking deep breaths to steady himself. He walked toward the spot where the object had rested, expecting perhaps scorched earth or churned soil. Instead, he found three sharply defined impressions in the grass, arranged in a perfect triangle. Each patch was about the size of a dinner plate, the grass flattened and warm to the touch, and the soil beneath compacted hard. The edges of the impressions were precise, with no damage to the surrounding grass. There were no footprints near the marks, not even his own yet, and no signs of an approach. The rest of the pasture was untouched. Back at the farmhouse, he phoned the local police station. 2 uniformed constables arrived within the hour, walking the site and questioning him carefully. They took note of the triangular layout, the identical size and depth of the impressions, and the absence of any other disturbance. Henshaw watched as one constable pressed his boot into the soil nearby for comparison. The grass there sprang back, and the soil gave easily, unlike the compacted patches. Photographs were taken from ground level, each with a scale marker placed beside the impressions. The constables could not identify a cause, but one remarked quietly that it didn't resemble the marks left by helicopters, which they sometimes saw during RAF training exercises. That afternoon, a man in plain clothes arrived at the farm in a dark saloon car. He introduced himself only as working with the Air Ministry and asked to see the site. His manner was calm, almost detached, but Henshaw noticed how meticulous he was in measuring the distance between each impression and sketching the triangular pattern. He collected small soil samples, placing them into labeled envelopes, and spent several minutes photographing the entire field from multiple angles. He made no statement about what he thought had caused the marks, but he did ask whether Henshaw had noticed any sound of aircraft before or after the sighting. When Henshaw replied that there had been nothing except the faint hum from the object itself, the man simply nodded, made a final note, and left. In the days that followed, the flattened grass began to lift, but the soil at each impression stayed hard, even after light rain. Puddles formed differently over them, the water beading rather than soaking in. Several of Henshaw's neighbors came to see the site, each remarking on how sharply the marks ended and how clean the surrounding grass remained. No formal update came from the police or the Air Ministry, but through a contact on the parish council, Henshaw learned that the case had been logged as unidentified aerial object with physical trace. A regional UFO research group visited soon after, interviewing him at length and taking their own soil samples. Their later report noted minor chemical changes in the compacted soil compared to control samples, though they stressed these were not harmful. The incident never made national headlines, appearing only as a short mention in the Shropshire Star. Henshaw was content with that. He had no interest in attracting ridicule. His account, when he did share it, remained unchanged. The craft had been silent except for the hum, its movements precise, and the two figures had seemed purposeful, but not aggressive. Over the years, researchers pointed out how closely the case resembled other British CE2 encounters of the 1970s. Small craft, humanoid occupants, triangular landing marks, and quiet but persistent interest from official channels. With the Ministry of Defense's UFO desk still active in Whitehall at the time, many such cases were examined in confidence and filed away without public explanation. By the following spring, there was nothing to show in the field. The grass had grown back, the soil had loosened, and livestock grazed freely across the spot. The impressions existed only in photographs and archived notes. For Henshaw, however, the experience never lost its clarity. He could recall the exact tilt of the craft as it rose, the precise layout of its landing supports, and the frozen, weightless feeling that had overtaken him. There had been no conversation, no warning, only the sudden presence of something wholly unfamiliar, and then its equally sudden absence. In the broader history of rural British UFO encounters, his case remained one of many understated events that hinted at a consistent pattern: an ordinary witness, tangible physical evidence, quiet official investigation, and no definitive answers. The morning passed into memory, but the unanswered questions lingered, as fixed in his mind as the marks had once been in the Shropshire grass. The Fortin de las Flores Landing, August 17th, 1977, Fortin de las Flores, Veracruz, Mexico. It was a humid summer night in August 1977 when 3 railway workers from Ferrocarriles Nacionales de Mexico were carrying out a routine track inspection near Fortin de las Flores, a quiet town nestled among the coffee plantations of Veracruz. The line they patrolled had long been notorious for mudslides during the rainy season, and as maintenance protocol required, night crews were often dispatched to walk the stretch with lamps and radio equipment to ensure track stability. On this particular evening, the workers, Antonio Garcia, Luis Arellano, and Julio Mendez, set out from the depot on foot shortly after 10 p.m., unaware that their names would soon be etched into one of Mexico's strangest UFO cases. As the trio neared a gently curving bend in the track near a gulch, Julio was the first to stop. He raised a hand and whispered, "Ven eso? Do you see that?" Hovering silently in the distance, perhaps 300 meters down the track, was a soft, amber-colored glow. It pulsed rhythmically, not like a flame or lantern, but more like a slow heartbeat. The workers, assuming it might be a work vehicle, approached cautiously. But as they came closer, the reality of what stood in the clearing defied explanation. A metallic disc, roughly 10 meters in diameter and shaped like 2 shallow bowls joined at the rim, hovered just 2 meters off the ground. It emitted no sound. Its surface was dull silver, but at its center, a band of rotating lights shimmered with pale greens and oranges. The craft was perfectly still above the overgrown railway clearing, which lay about 50 meters off the main track line. Then, movement. From a hatch beneath the craft, a ramp extended to the grass. 2 humanoid figures descended. Descriptions later provided by the men described beings approximately 5 feet tall, clad in tight-fitting suits that shimmered in the moonlight. Their heads were slightly enlarged, and though the darkness masked finer details, the witnesses noted their movements, graceful, methodical, and distinctly non-human. The beings began moving through the field, stopping at various bushes and low-lying plants. Each carried what appeared to be a device resembling a thin rod, which they passed slowly over the vegetation. In some cases, they plucked samples and placed them into small containers affixed to their belts. Antonio, frozen in place, muttered a prayer. Julio backed up several steps, accidentally snapping a twig beneath his boot. In that moment, one of the beings turned sharply toward them. Instantly, the humming silence broke. The disc emitted a deep, low-frequency hum that resonated in the workers' chests. The light band around the craft flared, turning from amber to a searing white. The 2 beings retreated quickly to the ramp. Julio dropped his lamp and yelled for the others to run. The 3 men fled in panic toward the main track line, radioing in what they could. Their voices, recorded on analog dispatch equipment, were filled with fear and confusion. Local law enforcement from Córdoba arrived within an hour, accompanied by railway supervisors and 2 military personnel from a nearby base who had been conducting joint infrastructure drills in the region. The site was still warm. The vegetation where the craft had hovered showed signs of heat exposure. Leaves were scorched and brittle, and several patches of grass had been pressed down in circular patterns. Police photographs taken that night show 3 equidistant indentations in the earth, forming a triangle about 3 meters across. No signs of conventional vehicle tracks or footprints were found, except for those of the witnesses. Local newspapers, including Diario de Xalapa and El Mundo de Córdoba, ran the story the following morning under the headline, Luces Misteriosas en Fortin, and included black and white photos of the scorched grass and official statements from police and railway authorities. Antonio Garcia was quoted as saying, "It was not from here. The air, the light, the way it moved, it was something else." An official inquiry by the railway company concluded that the men were credible and without history of intoxication or fabrication. Their employment files were reviewed, and no history of disciplinary issues was found. Despite skepticism from some quarters, their accounts were consistent in multiple interviews. Investigators from a civilian UFO research group in Mexico City, known as CIFEEAC, Centro de Investigación de Fenómenos Extraterrestres, Espaciales y Anómalos de México, visited the site several weeks later and took radiation readings. While levels were not dangerously elevated, they were higher than baseline background levels for the region. Thermal imaging taken during follow-up visits suggested residual heat patterns in the soil, consistent with accounts of a hovering object. Over the months that followed, local residents reported a handful of additional sightings: strange lights hovering over sugarcane fields, dogs barking at empty skies, and unusual burns found on crops. In one case, a farmer claimed to have discovered silvery ash beneath his banana trees. Samples taken by CIFEEAC were found to contain traces of magnesium and barium, though critics claimed these could have originated from agricultural fertilizers. For the railway workers, life did not return to normal. Julio suffered from recurring nightmares and left his post within a year, citing stress. Antonio and Luis gave occasional interviews, but avoided public appearances. They were not paid for their testimony, and consistently refused invitations to speak at UFO conventions, choosing instead to let their police statements stand as their contribution to the case. The Fortin de las Flores incident eventually faded from public memory, overshadowed by larger cases in the US and Europe. Yet within Mexico's UFO research community, it remains a foundational encounter, remarkable for its multiple witnesses, physical evidence, and immediate police involvement. The photographs of the damaged site, the thermal anomalies, and the frantic radio call all survive in private archives. What were the beings collecting in that overgrown field? Were the samples biological, chemical, or something else entirely? The methodical nature of the activity suggested purpose. Were they cataloging Earth's flora for analysis, or for something more? The truth remains elusive, as always, veiled behind the craft's sudden departure and the silence it left behind. But for those who were there, the memory remains seared in their minds. A quiet summer night turned historic. An ordinary patrol shattered by the extraordinary. The Voronezh Landing, September 27th, 1989, Voronezh, Soviet Union. "Kick it here!" one of the boys shouted, his voice carrying across the park. The football bounced unevenly over the grass, followed by laughter and the sound of running feet. Parents stood nearby, talking in low voices while they watched their children play. It was an ordinary September evening in the city of Voronezh. Then the game stopped. The children's eyes lifted as a bright red light rose above the tree line. At first, some thought it was a star or a flare, but within seconds it slowed and hovered. The glow grew stronger, spreading across the field. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. The ball rolled to a stop and was forgotten. Witnesses later said the stillness was more striking than the light itself. There was no sound, no engine, not even the whisper of wind. Above them hung a luminous object, larger than the apartment blocks that bordered the park, suspended silently in the evening sky. The craft did not rush. It lingered as though its presence alone was meant to be noticed. The glow from its surface lit the ground below, turning the park into a stage. Some children stepped back and clutched each other's hands. Others stood rooted in place. Adults whispered to each other, searching for an explanation, but the scale and silence suggested this was no ordinary aircraft. Slowly, a hatch opened beneath the sphere. Out of the light came 3 figures. They were immense, nearly 3 meters tall, with elongated heads and unusually long arms. Their steps were heavy, deliberate. Alongside them moved a smaller figure, mechanical in appearance, jerking forward in precise motions, as if programmed to follow. The witnesses could see them clearly. One boy later told police that the giants seemed to glide rather than walk. Another child described a faint whirring sound from the smaller machine, while others insisted there was no sound at all. What they all agreed upon was the dread that came with seeing something so alien cross the familiar grass of their park. One of the tall beings raised an arm. A red beam of light shot outward and struck a boy directly. In an instant, his body stiffened. Parents screamed as the child froze, unable to move or cry out. The paralysis lasted only seconds, but it was unforgettable. When the beam ended, the boy staggered back, frightened but unharmed. The next demonstration came quickly. The football, lying abandoned on the grass, was struck by the same red beam. In front of dozens of witnesses, it vanished, only to reappear several meters away. The children gasped. For them, it seemed like teleportation. For the adults, it was proof that they were witnessing something far beyond earthly technology. The beings lingered only minutes longer. Without rushing, they turned back toward the sphere. The hatch opened once again, and they stepped inside. The smaller robot followed. With an impossible silence, the craft lifted into the air, brightened, and shot upward until it vanished into the clouds. The entire encounter lasted less than 15 minutes. But for those who stood in the park that night, it stretched far longer. Several recalled the feeling that time itself had slowed, as if the moment had been stretched beyond normal measure. Parents wasted no time in calling the police. Officers arrived to find children in tears, trying to describe what had happened. Adults supported their accounts, adding details of their own. The police began taking statements by flashlight, moving methodically from child to child and parent to parent. The consistency of the testimonies was striking. Nearly every witness described the same elements: the glowing craft, the towering figures, the smaller machine, the red beam, and the vanishing football. For local authorities, such a mass of consistent stories could not be dismissed. Within days, scientists from the Voronezh Geophysical Institute were dispatched to the site. They carried measuring instruments and sample kits, examining the ground where the craft was said to have landed. Soil was dug up and sealed. Leaves and grass were clipped and bagged. Radiation levels were logged at values above the background norm. Certain patches of ground appeared compressed, as if a great weight had rested there briefly. Several plants looked dried and brittle, damaged in a way consistent with sudden exposure to heat or energy. This kind of official scientific involvement was unusual. The Soviet Union rarely dispatched researchers to parks based on stories from children. But here, the combination of eyewitness accounts and physical traces convinced authorities that the case warranted attention. Then came the most surprising development of all. On October 9, 1989, less than 2 weeks after the event, the telegraph agency of the Soviet Union, known as TASS, issued a report describing the Voronezh Landing in detail. The report included the glowing object, the 3 giant beings, the frightened children, and the vanishing football. It even named the scientists who had taken samples from the site. To understand the significance, one must recall what TASS represented. It was not a newspaper, but the official voice of the Soviet state. Nothing appeared on its wires without clearance. If TASS reported that giant beings had stepped out of a craft in a Voronezh park, it meant the government itself had permitted such information to be made public. Western journalists reacted with astonishment. Newspapers in London, Paris, and New York reprinted the report almost immediately, citing TASS as the source. For decades, Western media had accused the USSR of secrecy. Now, here was an official Soviet admission of an extraordinary event. For the first time, readers worldwide were discussing a UFO case based on the words of the Soviet state itself. In Voronezh, the days after were far from normal. Children who had been present refused to play in the park again. Parents reported that their sons and daughters woke at night from disturbing dreams. Teachers found students distracted, sketching drawings of the luminous craft and the tall figures instead of focusing on schoolwork. Some adults worried their children would be ridiculed. Others feared more serious consequences, that witnesses might be silenced. And yet, the accounts did not fade. The story had already spread through TASS, and no amount of caution could erase it from public memory. The scientists' findings never appeared in full. Hints of their conclusions circulated: elevated radiation, compressed soil, dehydrated plants. But detailed reports never reached the public. The initial openness that Glasnost seemed to allow soon gave way to silence. By winter, the newspapers no longer mentioned Voronezh. Official channels moved on. The mystery remains. Why did the Soviet government, usually careful with its reputation, permit this story to surface? Some historians point to the atmosphere of Glasnost under Mikhail Gorbachev, when restrictions on information had begun to loosen. Others believe the sheer number of witnesses made denial impractical. With so many voices, children, parents, police, and scientists, the story may have been too large to contain. Skeptics argued that the children had simply fallen into mass hysteria, turning a distant light into a tale of aliens and teleportation. But this explanation leaves gaps. It does not account for the measured soil anomalies, nor the brittle vegetation. It does not explain why TASS, the state's own news service, would risk its credibility by reporting the story. For those who stood in the park that night, skepticism was irrelevant. They remembered the glow that lit the grass. They remembered the towering figures. They remembered the beam that froze a boy in place, and the football that disappeared and reappeared before their eyes. Decades later, their memories remained sharp, undiminished by dismissal. The Voronezh Landing stands as one of the rare moments when ordinary citizens, police officers, scientists, and even the machinery of the state aligned on a single extraordinary account. Even more remarkable, it was acknowledged through official channels. In the broader context of UFO history, that acknowledgement is what sets Voronezh apart. Around the world, governments have most often chosen silence, suppression, or ridicule when faced with similar reports. In 1989, for reasons that remain unclear, the Soviet Union chose openness instead. For a brief time, the extraordinary was spoken plainly in the voice of the state. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the silence returned.